Well, good morning to all of you and to folks that are participating uh, in this roundtable. Uh, and I hope it's going to be informative. The purpose of the roundtable, quite simply, is to discuss historic and cultural preservation. But specifically, uh, we want to hear your thoughts on how Congress can strengthen historic and cultural preservation. Uh, Being on this resources committee and having the privilege of both being chair and ranking member, uh, much preferred chair, uh, central to one of the jurisdictional responsibilities is historic and cultural preservation and its importance. And how do we elevate that? And how do we make it uh, come to the forefront of the discussion going forward, whether it's the reauthorization, whether it is policy and legislative initiatives? How do we do that? And I think that's part of why you, as panelists, have been invited to discuss with us, members of Congress, and my colleagues are here, and they'll be introducing themselves in the question answer. I believe that the ranking member, uh, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, will be leaving to manage something on the floor soon, uh, and uh, and I'll offer her the opportunity before she does to move ahead because, like all the members, to be able to participate. There are clear themes that we would like to hear about today, including how do we preventing legislative exceptions of the National Historic Preservation Act, the impacts of climate change, and the reauthorization, as I mentioned, of the Historic Preservation Fund. This Congress, we have seen several bills completely waiving the environmental review and public participation requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and the National Historic Preservation Act. They've moved through the Resources Committee, uh, but the the administration has signaled very strongly that those are not going to go beyond there, and if they even get to the Senate, we committee Democrats have been committed to fighting these exceptions, and we'll continue to do that. And also the question of permitting and the role that the federal permitting steering council has in providing support for SHPOs and TIPOs in terms of streamlining that process. That's another question that we'd like to talk about. But I know that the reauthorization of the Historic Preservation Fund, which expired on September 30th, is a top mind of all of you. There is existing legislation. I hope that Congress can come together to ensure that federal agencies, state governments, and our state and tribal historic preservation offices get the critical funding and resources they need to continue identifying and preserving our nation's stories. Before I turn it over to the witnesses, I want to thank the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers for bringing their perspectives and recommendations here today. Past federal policies aimed at forcibly removing indigenous communities from their ancestral homelands have left many sacred sites outside of the jurisdiction of that particular tribe and Indian country in general. Our preservation laws were not designed with tribal nations in mind, and nor do they recognize tribes as a sovereign entity and a sovereign government. So, as we remember those things and look at them for the future, in terms of both legislative packages and very needed reforms and initiatives around this area, your perspectives today will help us frame that going forward. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you. And before I turn it over to the witnesses, let me extend to my colleagues that are here any comments, any welcoming comments, Mr. Beyer. Mr. Magazine.
all for being here and for your leadership. You know, in Rhode Island, we pack a lot of history and a lot of culture into a small state, and I'm very, as a freshman member, very excited to work with each of you. So thank you, and thank you to the ranking member for bringing us together.
Thank you. Teresa Fernández, representing the beautifully diverse 3rd Congressional District, where we actually know that it didn't all begin in Virginia, where we have, you know, I personally represent 16 different Native American tribes. I'm a 16th generation New Mexican on my European side, and know that all stories need to be told. And thank you so very much for coming here to help us learn how to make sure we preserve them and tell them.
Then before we transition to the panelists, and thank all of you for being here, let me say that looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today, but also, you know, at this interesting time in our history, real time in our history right now, when the question of history and identity about who this nation is, was, and how it defines who we are now, when that sometimes is not dealt with the honesty and factual integrity that it should be, and historic integrity that it should be, I think this role increases, because I think it is knowing not just our history, but our cultural contributions, not just by individual peoples, but as a nation. That's our identity. And I feel that by ignoring parts of it, minimizing or marginalizing parts of it, we hurt ourselves as a nation, and we hurt our identity as a nation. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and let me now begin by asking 5 minutes of remarks. I'm told here in the instructions, so be very careful to follow them. And after your statement is complete, we'll keep going till all 5 have had their opportunity, and then we'll turn it over to the committee. Ms. Kamlager-Dove, we did a welcome. You're more than welcome to do that as well. Thank you.
Chair, he's my chair, Representative Sidney Kamlager-Dove from California's 37th, which is Los Angeles. So our county is home to the Tongva and the San Gabrielino Nation tribes. I'm happy to be here to listen to you. I recognize that we like to use the history of our indigenous peoples often for our own benefit. And so it's always refreshing to actually be able to listen to all of the uncomfortable, complicated, linked histories to help us figure out how we deal with our future. So appreciate your time.
Thank you. And joining us also is representative from New Mexico, Ms. Stansbury. We are doing a welcome hello, and it's your turn. Thank you. Let me now recognize the Honorable Sara Bronin, who is Chair of the Historic Preservation Council on Historic Preservation.
Thank you so much, Congressman Grijalva, and thank you so much for being here today. It's my honor to serve as the chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The Advisory Council is the nation's federal historic preservation agency. It has 24 members, including 11 presidentially appointed members and representatives of 10 federal agencies and 3 preservation organizations. We administer and implement key provisions of the National Historic Preservation Act, including the Section 106 process, which, as you know, requires federal agencies to consider the impacts of their undertakings on historic properties. We also advise Congress, the executive branch, state and local governments, and others on historic preservation policy. On the Section 106 side of our work, briefly, the Advisory Council has embarked on a record number of streamlining initiatives to ensure that communities are getting the infrastructure they need. And we have actively engaged the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council as one of 16 federal agency members. Our track record of supporting successful project resolutions and our commitment to further streamlining are the principal reasons we generally oppose legislative exemptions to Section 106. I am happy to discuss our streamlining initiatives, including recent efforts underway related to housing in the question and answer period. But today, I wanted to highlight our agency's adoption and implementation of the federal government's first policy statement on climate change and historic preservation, and to ask for your partnership in advancing its principles. Consider the Statue of Liberty closed for 8 months following Superstorm Sandy, or the Alaska native town of Newtok entirely relocated due to sea level rise, or Lahaina in Hawaii decimated by wildfire. Contemporary conversations about climate change often overlook how it is already disrupting our connections to our past and our cultural heritage. With that context, I will make my first ask, which is that we work together to draft legislation creating a climate heritage office. We must be an international leader in this sphere. A U.S. Climate Heritage Office could help us modernize approaches to disaster, develop creative mitigation and adaptation strategies, and fortify historic infrastructure. It could also help us identify and coordinate needed research and train professionals and community members on best practices. We cannot create this office using existing staff or funding. At the Advisory Council, we have one staff member working very part-time on climate change issues. If we continue to under-resource the federal government's response, we will lose more irreplaceable places forever. Second, I ask for you to expand federal support for research on climate change and historic and cultural resources. We must identify the best materials, methods, and structures to adapt these resources to fire, flood, and other threats. We need research on renewable energy, energy-efficient building elements, and other sustainability features to inform amendments to building, energy, and zoning codes. And we need economic analysis as to which financial incentives and investments would maximize retention of historic places at risk. We must also understand Native and Indigenous practices that can inform effective climate resilience strategies. Third, I ask you for federal funding to digitize information about the nation's heritage. It is extremely difficult to protect historic places when we do not know where they are. Of course, some information, including information about tribal and archaeological resources, must remain confidential. However, the vast majority of historic places can and must be identified on a national map that integrates state, tribal, and local information. With that map, we could not only locate sites most at risk, but we could also help accelerate the Section 106 permitting process. This is an investment that is well worth making. So that's 3 things: a climate heritage office, research, and digitization. I'd like to recognize our Vice Chairman, Jordan Tannenbaum, and our Executive Director, Reed Nelson, who have been leading the efforts on climate change policy at the Advisory Council. And we look forward together to working with you to advance these ideas. Next, you're going to hear from 4 panelists who represent key constituencies and also serve as members of the Advisory Council. Our presidentially appointed tribal member, Chairman Reno Franklin, will discuss our recent policy statement on burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects, as well as a pending policy statement on Indigenous knowledge. The other panelists will promote the permanent reauthorization of the Historic Preservation Fund, enhancements to the Rehabilitation Tax Credit, and additional funding for state and tribal historic preservation officers. The Advisory Council strongly supports these fundamental components of the National Historic Preservation Program. Thank you again for convening this conversation and for including us in it.
Thank you very much. Now, let me recognize Mr. Shaw Sprague, who is the Vice President of Government Relations for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Grijalva. Thank you, members of the committee and interested members in cultural and historic preservation. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Sprague, and I'm the Vice President of Government Relations at the National Trust. The National Trust is a privately funded, charitable, educational, and nonprofit organization chartered by Congress in 1949 to facilitate public participation in historic preservation. Next year, the National Trust will celebrate our 75th anniversary and highlight the positive impact that historic preservation has had on our communities. Since our founding, we have worked closely with Congress, and particularly this committee, to advocate on behalf of our nation's irreplaceable historic and cultural resources. Our testimony highlights a section of preservation issues for discussion and as well as additional resources that we look forward to following up with for future conversations. First, the Historic Preservation Fund is the principal source of funding to implement the nation's historic preservation programs. The resources provided through the HPF are essential in supporting preservation initiatives across the nation, including historic surveys, National Register nominations, Section 106 reviews, public education, and federal historic tax credit approvals. Since its establishment in 1977, the HPF has had an authorized level of $150 million annually, subject to annual appropriations. The program did not see its fully authorized amount appropriated, however, until FY22 at $173 million. The National Trust was extremely encouraged that in FY23, Congress funded the HPF at $204 million, the highest appropriated amount in the program's history. As you'll hear more about from the panel, the HPF provides grants distributed by formula to SHPOs and TIPOs, which are facing significant challenges in keeping up with this important work. We are also seeing a transformative impact in many communities through the HPF's competitive grant programs. These programs are helping preserve a more diverse and more complete history while simultaneously revitalizing communities and creating jobs. Efforts to reauthorize the HPF, which expired on September 30th, are underway and being led by the co-chairs of the Historic Preservation Caucus, Representatives Blumenauer and Turner, and we're joined by Representative Fernández and Representative Carey as original co-sponsors. The Historic Preservation Fund Reauthorization Act, H.R. 3350, would reauthorize the HPF for 10 years and increase the authorized amount from $150 million to $250 million annually. What we would consider a modest increase given the length of time that that authorized level has been in place and adjusted for inflation. We urge the committee to reauthorize the HPF with an eye toward the nation's upcoming 250th anniversary and all that we want this program to achieve in the years ahead. The National Trust also strongly supports improvements to the federal historic tax credit, which has not been strengthened since it was made a permanent part of the tax code in 1986. The federal historic tax credit is one of the most successful public-private partnerships Congress has created to preserve historic buildings and promote economic growth. Since inception, the HTC has encouraged approximately $191 billion in private investment in our communities, rehabilitated 48,000 historic buildings, and created more than 3 million jobs. Today, however, challenges are mounting for the credit: a loss in investment value, high labor and construction costs, staffing and capacity issues, and different policy objectives are making these projects more difficult. The most effective way for you to support the Federal Historic Tax Credit is to co-sponsor the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, H.R. 1785, introduced by Representatives LaHood and Blumenauer. In recent months, the committee has explored legislative proposals addressing federal permitting reform, and these conversations have included the implementation of critical laws like the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. These laws play a critical role in giving our communities, including those that have been historically underrepresented, a voice to help shape and refine federally permitted projects to assist in avoiding and minimizing their adverse impacts. The National Trust strongly opposes any legislative exemptions to compliance with NHPA or NEPA, and we support efforts to improve and streamline the federal permitting process through greater federal investments in staffing and modernizing documentation of historic and cultural resources. Lastly, we want to thank this committee for their recent support of a wide variety of federal designations that preserve and protect places on our public lands, including the Brown v. Board of Education National Historic Park Expansion and Redesignation Act and the Amache National Historic Site Act. In our testimony, we note examples of pending legislation that would further protect historic and cultural resources, including the bipartisan Route 66 National Historic Trail Designation Act, H.R. 4338. Designating Route 66 as a National Historic Trail will have a significant economic impact in the 8 states along the iconic route, spur critical preservation efforts, and appropriately recognize the historic roadway ahead of its upcoming centennial celebration in 2026. That concludes my testimony, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and participate in the discussion.
Thank you very much. And now let me welcome and recognize the Honorable Reno Franklin, Chairman of the Kashia Band of Pomo Indians of Stewart's Point, Rancheria. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're welcome, and time is yours.
Thank you. Do this correctly first here. He'en maya iwa toshish jima emta Reno County Franklin. I'm the tribal chairman of the Kashia Pomo tribe. I am ta Winama Bake Yachma. I come from the people from the top of the land. I want to first just recognize the fact that you've done this. Chairman Grijalva, thank you so much for inviting all of us. And Teresa, I think I owe you forever for teaching me how to not look like an idiot when I order green or red chili at a restaurant in New Mexico for the rest of my life. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. I want to acknowledge that the Lieutenant Governor from the Gila River tribe has honored us with her presence and is sitting in the back. And thank you so much for traveling this way and being here and sitting here with us as we go over some stuff that is near and dear to my heart. So quickly about myself, I apologize if you see me texting. I have a teenage daughter at home, and she does not recognize that Dad has to sit here and testify in front of all of you, and is texting me at a very early hour. So Kayla, I love you. Stop sending the messages. I'm not only a tribal chairman, but first and foremost a tribal chairman, but I also an Obama appointee to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and I'm proud to serve on that. Also the TIPO advisor for the Enterprise Rancheria. So I just kind of wanted to discuss some potential things, some issues that we see in Indian country, a few reminders that are painful, but I think that you all expect that out of a tribal chair with the history that the country has towards us. So, first and foremost, the efforts to streamline the permitting process. People sometimes forget that permitting process exists on Indian reservations as well, and sometimes can be cumbersome on us. The idea and the thought of how to streamline that process must be done with tribes and not to tribes. And it's an important thing to note that tribes are generally supportive of it as long as it's done in a manner that is respectful of tribal cultural resources. Our sacred sites are non-renewable resources. Once those get wiped out, it's not like you can rebuild that. So it's really important to note that there's deep and historic issues around how we manage these streamlined operations. In 1949, when the National Trust was established, and then again in 1966, when the National Historic Preservation Act was first approved, the United States was still very much deep into a cultural war and genocide against American Indian people. Policies were not geared towards us. They were, like I said, geared against us. The NHPA certainly did not look at Indian tribes and think that, oh my gosh, these tribes have the ability to manage these sacred sites, these historic places. And in fact, it was the exact opposite. It wasn't until much later, in the 1990s, that TIPOs were introduced. And that tells you the kind of the state of mind and the history of historic preservation in the United States. And so once TIPOs came into effect and we began to manage our own resources, you can see a real clear change in the way that historic preservation was done in Indian country, being very conformed with not just law, but finding a way. And one of the things that all of us TIPOs do is we manage two spaces. It's a reference to 2 feet and 2 canoes at the same time. And that is the traditional way of managing cultural resources. and the Section 106 way, the National Historic Preservation Act way of managing cultural resources. And TIPOs are challenged with finding ways to merge those two things into one and make it beautiful. So we do. A big part of the challenge for TIPOs today is the amount of dollars that TIPOs are receiving. Tribal historic preservation officers receive funding that is nowhere near the amount that we need in order to adequately do our job to the best of the abilities and protect not just our own historic resources, but the historic resources of the country. And certainly American Indian, Native American, Native Hawaiian cultural resources and historic resources are a shared resource with the rest of the country, and only tribes. And I would say that in the case of any of the interpretation of these sites can only be done by tribes. And in that case, only by those individuals who are authorized on behalf of the tribe to speak to the significance of what these places are. So the adequate funding of TIPOs is on par with our SHPO brethren, but we rely heavily on that. We have around 210, about 5 to 10 new TIPOs come in each year. The process to become a TIPO is very complicated, and in its form that it currently sits in, extremely disrespectful to tribes, making us prove that we understand how to manage cultural resources, something that we've done for thousands of years. So, we have 4 asks. I'm looking at my clock to my right. My brother has up, and I appreciate him. We have 4 asks, and the first one is about TIPOs and removing the barriers for tribes to become TIPOs. Work with us, create a better process that's desperately needed. The second is to provide TIPOs with adequate funding that truly meets the trust responsibility of the United States government to tribes to protect sacred sites. Our third ask is to use existing laws to offer greater protections to tribal nations, cultural resources, and sacred places. Certainly, we've seen that happen with Oak Flat, Thatcher Pass, places that, and we appreciate the efforts of the committee to help with that. But use those laws, help us with that. Explore how existing laws can be amended or new laws created to better protect tribal nations' cultural resources and sacred places. And then 2 things that are near and dear to my heart, because it's ACHP work, and the ACHP has a burial policy statement that now includes African American slave burials. We would hope that the committee would take the time to review that, look at it, and find ways to incorporate that into to new laws and policies and work with the ACHP on that. And finally, the Indigenous Knowledge Policy Statement from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. We get that request from federal agencies a lot. That's a technical term, a lot. And our goal is to work with them to provide guidance. We've had 13 consultations with American Indian tribes and Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiian organizations and federal agencies on Indigenous knowledge. That policy statement will be coming soon. And it's our hope that the committee would take a look at that and once again support it and find ways to actively insert that into existing law or create new laws around it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now invite and recognize Dr. Shasta Grogan, who is the chair of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and the environmental director and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pala Band of Mission Indians. Doctor, you're welcome.
Thank you, Ranking Member Grijalva and fellow members of the House of Representatives. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this roundtable on historic and cultural preservation. I serve as the Environmental Director and Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pala Band of Mission Indians, and I am the chair of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, which is proudly celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. NAPCO is composed of tribal preservation leaders who are committed to protecting culturally important places that perpetuate Native identity, resilience, and cultural endurance. NAPCO greatly appreciates your steadfast support, Ranking Member Grijalva, for the preservation and protection of tribal nations' cultural resources and sacred places. Under the National Historic Preservation Act, TIPOs are required to consult on federally funded and permitted projects, but unfortunately they have not received the funding necessary to fulfill this responsibility. TIPOs receive funding through the Historic Preservation Fund, which was last reauthorized in 2016, and that authorization expired on September 30th of this year. they need to do their work. Once TIPOs are funded at a level that allows them to address the flood of requests for consultation, both on tribal nations' current lands and their ancestral lands, there can be a thoughtful conversation about potential changes to the permitting process. Until then, that conversation cannot take place because it is impossible to determine if there is truly a problem, and if so, what is the scope of that problem. Our historic and cultural preservation program
Sure,
reflects
good.
the America of 2023, not the America of 1966 when the NHPA became law, or 1976 when the HPF became law. Today's America recognizes that tribal nations' cultural and natural resources are worthy of preserving and protecting, that tribal nations' sacred places are deserving of reverence and respect. Today's America acknowledges the unjust removal of peoples from lands they have stewarded since time immemorial, and that restoration of rights and traditional knowledge is the only way forward together. It is time for the respect America has for tribal nations to be reflected in the way it supports TIPOs and the sacred work they do to protect Native places. Thank you for holding this roundtable discussion and considering my testimony, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And let me now recognize Mr. Eric Hine, who is the Executive Director of the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers. Sir, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Ranking Member Grijalva, members of the committee, and a special greeting to Representative Fernández, who I had the pleasure of working with on the Advisory Council. I'm Eric Hine, Executive Director of the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, which represents the state historic preservation officers in all 50 states, territories, and the District of Columbia. Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you. You've heard from my colleagues this morning about a lot of very specific things that I agree with and want to emphasize are of great importance. The reauthorization of the Historic Preservation Fund, preferably permanently, the need for additional funding, the good work done by grant programs, the challenges we are facing with the push to streamline environmental reviews, how historic preservation can help mitigate the effects of climate change, and how it needs to protect the places that are sacred to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. In my written statement, I've detailed several recommendations that we feel would be of great help. Not unlike today, the National Historic Preservation Act was founded during a time of major federal activity in transportation, energy, and urban renewal, and other projects. At the time, however, we gave very little thought to their impact on the environment, to communities, and to our historic places. In some cases, entire neighborhoods were cut off by highways, historic places were disfigured or destroyed, and citizens had absolutely no voice in the process. By 1966, it was clear something needed to be done so that our tax dollars could be used more responsibly and so that better decisions could be made. The National Historic Preservation Act did something remarkable. Unlike other countries, which empowers a singular authority over heritage, the Act established a partnership that delegated responsibilities and required participation from a system of state and tribal historic preservation offices, local governments, and the public. It was designed to be participatory. By 1976, it was clear that regular funding was needed to run this program, to prevent it from being an unfunded mandate. This is when the Historic Preservation Fund was born. Since that time, the HPF has provided formula-based funding to states and territories, matched a minimum of 40%, for them to discharge their federally delegated responsibilities. Those responsibilities include federal project review, known as Section 106, historic tax credit project review, which I'll note is a key producer of affordable housing, National Register listings, survey and inventory, education, local government work, and a variety of other tasks. Unfortunately, in addition to having the HPF's authorization expire at the end of September, that funding has not kept pace with inflation, meaning when looking at inflation-adjusted dollars, SHPOs are actually receiving less funding today than they did in 1981 during the Reagan administration. The impact is real. In the midst of unprecedented federal project spending, which I'll add averages out to be several thousand projects per year per state for review, SHPOs in many cases are unable to compete and match the salaries in the job market. They're facing up to 30% vacancy rates in their offices. They're unable to invest in modern survey, GIS, and data systems, having to rely on 20th century paper records, slowing down the federal project review process. Federal agencies, in contrast, are ramping up and pushing to get projects out the door. They sometimes express frustration that reviews by SHPOs and TIPOs take too long. Even if they're sympathetic, such as the Federal Permitting Steering Council, they tell us they're unable to find legal mechanisms to provide any support. The solution to some is to focus on streamlining measures or to exempt certain projects from Section 106. While there are always ways to seek efficiencies, such as through the programmatic solutions in the Advisory Council's regulations, the push to make projects move faster has frequently focused on ways to take SHPOs and TIPOs out of the equation, overlooking a fundamental point: participation. To prevent the kind of mistakes we made in the past, federal projects rely upon it. Lack of funding for SHPOs and TIPOs and bypassing public participation are not worthy cost savings and efficiency measures. They run counter to the National Historic Preservation Act and make projects vulnerable to more delays from surprise discoveries, legal challenges, and public opposition. As we look ahead to our 250th anniversary, I believe we can unite around a shared commitment to not only recognize our complex history, but to be sure our future generations can continue to feel it, touch it, and experience it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I stand ready to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and to all our panelists. And let me, to begin the process, turn to my colleagues, Ms. Ledger Fernández, for any questions or comments you might have, and I'll go down the table.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member, and as everybody said, preferably Chair and soon to be Chair again of the Natural Resources Committee. It does feel like coming home to be talking about cultural resources, since we served as Obama appointees together and as I was Vice Chair. And so these issues are things that we hold dear because we know that America is stronger when we know all the stories, when we know the stories that began here, the Native American stories, the Latino stories, the AAPI, the Black history of what has happened here. Because I think that in these moments of stress that we are going through right now, where our democracy is under stress, we are better off when we understand the difficulties, because it is about us overcoming those difficulties, and it is about that future that we can see because of our difficult past and how we've overcome. And that means that we are not, as I say in Spanish, no hay solamente hay nosotros, no otros, right? When we say we are all us and not a them. And that's what the work you do does for America. And so we need to support it. I will be reintroducing the Historic Preservation Enhancement Act, which does call for the permanent reauthorization with the $300 million. And we are working on doing that soon and working with Senator Heinrich to make sure that happens. Because I think what's really important is the point that was made about all of these marvelous projects that we invested for the first time in generations in America, but we can't get them done without the 106 process, and we cannot shortchange that. Thank you, Dr. Goggin and Chair Franklin, for your comments on the importance of maintaining the tribal historic preservation, the participation. Share with us a little bit about, maybe Chair Franklin, about what that looks like. When a TIPO simply does not have the resources, give us an example of what that looks like on the ground.
Yeah, so there's several examples of that, both on and off of trust lands. Offhand, thinking of different projects, I typically don't like to call out federal agencies because I sit at the table in the ACHP with all of them, as you know. But there have been some large-scale projects, renewable energy projects in Southern California, very close to your district, ma'am. And in those cases, tribes are being asked to review very large projects. And TIPOs that are a part of those large projects, they're asked to be surveying, to go bring that information back to elders and interpret what that site means. To some people, it looks like it's just a rock, but as we know, it's a traditional cultural property and it has significance and meaning, and then in the type of significance and meaning that could only be identified and only being interpreted by those elders. So we're asking TIPOs to review projects that include hundreds of those sites and similar sites to them, and in a very short amount of time with very little funding. And if they're not able to do that, those sites get impacted. It's a double-edged sword of badness, so to speak, and that not only do those sites get impacted, but projects also undergo unnecessary delays because of the fact that those TIPOs aren't adequately funded to review those large projects. And in other cases, my TIPO office for my tribe, that poor guy, I hardly ever see him anymore. And it's because he's constantly in the field. He's got 300 or 400 emails. The big joke is whose email box is worse, mine as chairman or his as TIPO.
Right. So, I was going to go to a question with you next, but you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add that yesterday we had a federal permitting improvement steering council meeting where this issue came up. And what I've asked our staff to do is to identify how the ACHP can integrate compensation for tribal members, TIPOs or tribes, in our processes.
Right, because that's something that we had looked at in the past when we recognized that they are indeed the experts and that they need to be compensated. And the idea of saying not just the funding through hopefully it is $300 million at some point in time, but actually looking at, are there ways of having this cost be part of large projects? Like what could we do within the appropriations process so large projects actually have that incorporated in there? I wanted to go quickly, Chairwoman, and I'm so glad that we actually can say that now.
Thank you.
About the issue of needing to focus on the climate crisis and what it is doing in that research. Very supportive of that. We'll be really interested in working with you on that legislation together with the committee. So share a little bit, because I'm trying to keep, I've run out of time, but that is, I think, so key, because we are going to pay so much more if we don't do it now to the loss of that which cannot be replaced. So thank you for raising that.
And did you want for me to address any particular? Oh, sure.
You can, but I've turned to my colleagues for their questions and comments, because inevitably we get called off to do something else like voting or something, and this conversation and this topic is something that I think their participation with you is very important. Ms. Stansbury, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairwoman. Certainly, in a few moments, I'd love to also hear your thoughts if you want to kind of synthesize and bring it together. So, Chairman Grijalva, we just so appreciate your leadership on this issue. And I also want to extend my thanks not only to our panel, but all of the tribal leaders who are with us today, as well as out there listening. I'm Melanie Stansbury, and I'm proud to represent New Mexico's 1st Congressional District. And as you all are probably aware, New Mexico is a place where our culture, our history, our languages are not only a part of what we preserve and hold dear, but how we continue our cultures and ways of life in New Mexico. So these issues are not just about preserving history so that we can go visit it and enjoy it, but really about preserving the cultures and identities of our peoples. And there's probably few places on the planet where our communities are so keenly aware of this, with the exception, of course, of our Indigenous and historic communities across the nation. I am also a proud member of the Historic Preservation Caucus, though I don't have the technical expertise and knowledge of our senior member from New Mexico. But I've spent my entire career and life working on land and water rights issues, which are also part and parcel of this conversation. Historic preservation, as we know, is not just about preserving buildings and cultural monuments, but it's about preserving the stories, traditions, and values that our special places and landscapes and cultural sites embody, and how those make us whole as people. So this is such an important conversation, especially as we're in this critical juncture in our democracy, in the future of our nation as collective nations, and also in remembering the histories that shape who we are. In New Mexico, there are a number of key cultural properties that myself and our entire New Mexico delegation, led by Congresswoman Ledger Fernández, are deeply working on trying to preserve and protect, including Chaco Canyon, which is one of the most important sacred and religious sites for our Pueblo and Dene ancestors in New Mexico. I was actually born in San Juan County, and my father actually was in New Mexico this weekend with me and brought a picture of our family at Chaco Canyon. And I've shared this before, but on a cold morning, you can stand on the mesa overlooking Pueblo Bonito, which is the main ruins that are currently preserved within our national park system, and see the cultural sites that extend for miles and miles and miles. And what you realize when you look out across that landscape, that sacred religious landscape, is that it is not only something that we have to preserve because of its history, but it is a living cultural landscape that our Pueblo and Dene communities are still connected to through prayer, through dances, and the traditional structures that are preserved in the communities today. And so the protection of that landscape is much deeper than just protecting the sacred landscape itself, but also in the cultures and languages of our people. And the same is true of Caja del Rio, which is another place in New Mexico and Congresswoman Ledger Fernández's district that we're working to preserve, that includes petroglyphs along the ancient roads that our pueblos have connected through for many millennia, and also is the path of the old Spanish highway that connected Santa Fe to Mexico City. So there are many, many places that are sacred in New Mexico. And in addition to that, of course, we're working with our land grants, our traditional land grants that come out of our Chicano heritage in New Mexico, to ensure that those sites that are important to the preservation and culture of those communities continues as well. But we also know, as many of you have highlighted today, that there are a lot of threats, whether that's threats from climate change, vandalism, development activities on our federal lands, oil and gas development, but also how we tell the histories of these places. I was struck 2 years ago, we joined Secretary Holland at Chaco Canyon with tribal and Pueblo leaders from across New Mexico. And some of the elders from our tribal communities who joined us that day shared some of the ways in which their communities continue to be tied to that place. And much of the way in which we tell American history in our public places does not reflect the cultures and histories for whom those places are significant. And so part of our job is to make sure that the entire story and the many cultures and languages of our peoples are reflected in those stories. I think one of the other challenges that we've heard reflected here today is that while there is a continuity to culture and language and identity, oftentimes our bureaucracies don't align with that. And whether that's the processes by which we identify those resources, the geographic bureaucracies of the different jurisdictions, or just having the resources to hire more cultural managers to go out and to document and to ensure that these places are protected. So the way that I look at these issues is that it's not just a privilege and something that we should be doing, but it is part of our fundamental responsibility to protect these spaces. But I also think that there's another element that we haven't discussed as much this morning, which is how to repatriate those resources back to the communities who have cared for them for generations. Because we cannot forget the history of our own nation, and that many of these resources sit on what we now call federal lands, but that were previously lands that were held or cared for or stewarded by the indigenous and historic communities that were there in the first place. And so I strongly support the repatriation of our tribal, indigenous, and traditional lands back to the peoples who've cared for them since time immemorial, and to ensure that that is part of what we're talking about when we talk about historic preservation. So we have only a short amount of time here today. I ran out of time during my time as well, but I look forward to the conversation from all of you as we move forward, and I will pass it back to Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to the vice ranking member of our full committee, Ms. Kamlager-Dove, please.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, who I call chair as well. So as I mentioned, I represent Los Angeles, and it is home to the nation's largest concentration of Native Americans, with over 140,000 tribal citizens calling Los Angeles home. It's quite a paradox, since Los Angeles is also home to a growing number of non-Spanish speaking and indigenous people migrating to the area from their native lands in Guatemala and southern Mexico. And as I mentioned, Los Angeles is home to the Tongva and San Gabrielino Nation tribes and descendants, who many of whom also live in South LA. And I think that our tapestry is richer because of them. So I did want to share connections to Los Angeles, because I know most people think it's an urban paradise, but we've got some history. I also want to share that I sit on our federal lands subcommittee, and the mind-numbing disrespect that comes from some of our colleagues when we are talking about indigenous communities and tribal lands will make your head explode, which is why I think this is an important counter to some of what we have to endure in that committee. I also, and in fact today in EMR, we're having a discussion about drilling on tribal land, and essentially, how do we silence communities so that, you know, corporations can drill where they want to drill. I appreciate you, Chair Franklin, for talking about code switching. You didn't really say it, but I connected with it deeply, because I too live in a world where I have to code switch. So allyship in that. So my question, and I guess I'd love to have anyone answer it, and I'd love to start with Dr. Shasta, who's virtual, because oftentimes we forget about folks that are coming to us through the Zoom world. But, you know, our challenge is we have committees, we invite people to talk, and invariably our colleagues co-opt certain indigenous communities who are going to be used as their mouthpieces for all of the tribal community to essentially say what they want to hear. And that's not really sharing truth. It's sort of pitting one group's existence over another. And so how do we manage that?
That's an excellent question.
And please share what we should know as members who are searching for truth, recognizing that oftentimes it will be uncomfortable, and oftentimes it is complicated, and there are no easy answers, and one's history is linked to someone else's, and there might be divergent expectations, even if the outcome is the same. And my assumption is that the outcome is people want to live, they want to be able to practice their own self-determination, and folks don't want to be dependent on subsidy and, a patriarchal relationship with the United States of America. I could be wrong about that. But if you could help me understand how to navigate that, it would be helpful, because you all are used as pawns on the regular, and I need help calling that out more.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to answer that question. And also, yeah, thanks a lot for giving me the hardest question. And also, thank you for calling me Dr. Shasta. It makes things easy for everybody. The last name is gone, just like gone fishing. The Irish like to put extra letters in there just to make things confusing. That is a really difficult question that you're asking. And what we find is that even within an individual tribal community, there may be people who
Mr. Magaziner?
Well, thank you very much again to our panelists and to our once and future chair, Mr. Grijalva. As one of the few Northeastern members on the Natural Resources Committee, I often come at things from a slightly different angle. I want to start by elevating establishing a climate heritage office, which I fully support. When you wrote about that and spoke about it, I immediately thought about neighborhoods in Rhode Island like Wickford and North Kingstown, The Point in Newport. We have been blessed with tremendous historical housing stock in Rhode Island, particularly colonial era housing on the coast that is now directly threatened by sea level rise and climate change. And what's great about some of these areas is not only do they have this incredible historic housing stock, which drives tourism and hospitality in our economy, but these are neighborhoods that people still live in. These are not theme parks. And there is a direct line to the modern day as well. So incorporating climate resiliency into our historic preservation planning is absolutely vital. And I would just ask, as the New England representative, that we remember coastal communities as we do that work, and I certainly support what you're advocating for there. Switching gears slightly, I want to explore a little bit more how the historic tax credit program can help expand the supply of housing in places like Rhode Island that are struggling with severe housing shortages. We have a severe housing shortage in Rhode Island right now, as do many other places around the country. And we also have significant historic building stock, old mill buildings, factory buildings, many of which have already been converted into housing through the historic tax credit. Historic tax credits in the last year alone provided more than 1,800 jobs in the state and have added, for example, a 250-unit apartment complex in West Warwick, Rhode Island at the Royal Mill Complex, another 60 units at the Rochambeau Worsted Will Factory, an Imperial Knife Factory in Olneyville and Providence, and the list goes on and on. 52% of Rhode Island's federal historic tax credit has been for projects that have led to new housing. So a majority, in Rhode Island at least, of these tax credit dollars have gone to creating housing at a time when we desperately need it. So my question for our panelists, and I directed at you, Chairwoman, at Mr. Sprague, Mr. Hine, what else can we be doing as a Congress to expand the ability of the historic tax credit to help create more housing while also preserving historic structures that add to the fabric of our communities?
Thank you, Congressman. Your question is very timely. The Advisory Council is currently, this week, I hope, submitting our final draft to members for a housing and historic preservation policy statement that recognizes that the affordable housing and actually housing in general shortage is affecting communities all over the country. I should add that I'm coming from Connecticut, Hartford being a place where you have seen a large number of historic tax credit projects that have created housing. Part of our policy statement, which is consistent with our past support as a council of HTC Go and enhancements to the historic tax credit, focuses on the role of tax credits in creating housing, recognizing that many projects involve conversions of office and commercial buildings, industrial buildings to housing, and also recognizing that there are barriers to that, not just with building codes, energy codes, and zoning codes, but also in some ways with our own federal approach. So whether it's looking at these enhancements, whether it's reconsidering that 10% credit for just generally historic buildings, even when they're not on the National Register, or whether it's looking within, including at the federal standards that are used to judge historic preservation projects, we need to be looking at all of the strategies. That's something that is top of mind for us. I expect that our members will vote to adopt this housing policy statement when we put out the final draft that was responsive to public comment, and we'll look forward to trying to implement that with you. But again, this is an extremely important issue for preservationists to take the lead on. We are trying to do that at the Advisory Council. We're trying to look at all approaches. On the last point on federal standards, I will say that a few months ago, we did submit a call for public comments on the way that the federal standards are administered and implemented at all levels of government, local commissions, states, and our federal considerations. And we did get a number of comments from historic tax credit developers that they were applied too strictly in different contexts to housing projects. And so that's something that, again, we need to look within, we need to look to you in partnership with, and we'll look forward to having those conversations in the future.
Congressman Magaziner, thank you for the question. It's an area that the National Trust has focused on extensively over the last decades on how to maximize the historic tax credit to provide housing, but also revitalize communities. You're right, it is a housing predominant program. You're seeing it's not just a statistic in Rhode Island. More than 50% of HTC projects in almost every state go toward housing, and a significant portion of that provides low and moderate income housing. There are provisions in the HTC Go bill that would make it easier to combine the low income housing tax credit with the federal historic tax credit, and without getting into the particular technical details, it would eliminate basis adjustment requirements, which would essentially make it a more attractive credit for low-income housing developers. So we would put that forward.
Mr. Byers, sir.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. And thank all of you. I really appreciate your being here. I live in Old Town Alexandria, laid out in 1749, in a house that was built in 1793. So I'm a huge believer in the historic tax credit. Although we've never used it because I'm a member of Congress, it wouldn't be appropriate. I do serve on Ways and Means Committee, where this is a really important deal. We're not time immemorial. We actually can relate to all this stuff. But one of the things that's fascinating about being a Virginian is we have 2,500 historic signs. People will come and just drive the highways and byways and read every darn one of them. And it's an amazing way to understand our history. But I understand that there's not nearly enough money for educational materials and signage. And so, Chairwoman Bronin, what value would allocating more funds for signage and educational materials have on Americans' understanding of our own history, which, as a parens, is incredibly divided right now?
Yes, well, I think that telling the full story is something that consistently across the National Trust, across everybody here at this table, and of course the Advisory Council as well, is something that we've been trying to do. You look at the Mellon Foundation's announcement this week that they'll be spending $500 million on its sculptures and other commemorative works that help to expand people's understanding of American history in their own communities. And you think what a transformative process and investment that might be. And so a parallel investment at the federal government level of investing in not commemorative works, but the historic sites themselves to uplift history, to identify places which have been underrepresented. Studies that have been done on the National Register of Historic Places in particular, for example, have shown that the majority of resources on that register have fallen within the, I guess you would say the dominant culture. And so underrepresented on the National Register even are sites associated with marginalized communities, sites associated with tribal communities, low-income communities, and so on. So that is something that preservationists recognize, and the question is what to do about it. Federal investment could make a big difference in making sure that full American story is told, whether it's through investments in actually getting things on the National Register, investments in the sites themselves. We had some programs like that in the past where there have been grant programs for communities, but those have never been enough. And I know that my colleagues, as well as the Advisory Council, have advocated for more funding for that. So we would love to partner with you on that. It's a huge opportunity for us now. It's a huge priority for me as the first chair of color as a Mexican American on the Advisory Council. So yes, please.
Okay. Mr. Hine, I know there are lots of historians and experts who are not part of the SHPOs or the TIPOs. How do we better engage them?
Well, that's an excellent question, Mr. Beyer. There are a few other mechanisms, actually, aside from the SHPO office itself, that do exist, and there's some areas that you could expand upon. But we have state commissions, which are basically are independent bodies of the SHPO that participate in the National Register process. Those are very traditionally academic historians and representatives of communities. Local communities certainly have their own historic preservation ordinances and commissions as well. But I think that one area that SHPOs really struggle with, and it's mostly due to their limited funding, it's their education and outreach component. That is one of their responsibilities under the Act, but it is labor intensive. Being able to have the staff capacity to be able to go out into the field, to be able to go out and visit communities, meet with people, to have meetings, to have one-on-one, to visit places. That itself can be a real challenge. Look at states like California and Texas, for example. There's some great logistical challenges to getting your staff all around the state to be able to meet with folks. So unfortunately, that ends up being a piece that a lot of SHPOs really struggle to try to fund. And that's an area that really could be improved with some more resources.
Mr. Franklin, I mentioned earlier the disappearance of tribes in Virginia, and now we're back. We've recognized a bunch of them with lots of work over the years. What would more funding for the TIPOs mean in terms of actually telling that story in places like Virginia, where it's all about the Civil War rather than about the Native Americans that were there long before we showed up?
I appreciate that question, and I would first say Virginia is for lovers. And so apparently your signs work. If they reached an Indian boy from Northern California. So applying that same principle to how you explain and how you teach about the tribal folks that remain despite some serious challenges in your state, I think that that's where the money is at, right? Provide those funds, help those tribes, empower those tribes to not just get 106 training and training on historic preservation, but implementation on how to do it as well. I think that if you were to reach out to those tribal communities and ask them how you can support them in not just preserving their culture that exists, but also in telling their story and how they want that story told. Maybe you had Virginia's for Lover Indians next time.
They did, we Northern Europeans married up a number of times. I yield back.
Thank you. And thank you very much. And just, states have these mottos, Virginia's for lovers, New Mexico, land of enchantment, that my better half tells me over and over again, because she's from New Mexico, that between Arizona and New Mexico, there's no question, and she seems to win that argument. I can't think of the motto for Arizona. I think it's, it might be, the current one is, they're crazy, we're not. That's, I don't know, but I don't know how far that's going. Mr. Sprague, let me ask you, the importance of the reauthorization was mentioned, how important that is, then you talked about how the fund impacts communities and everything. What, September 30th comes and goes, and we're still sitting on that reauthorization, the need for an enhancement of funds, in addition to what has been a static amount for years and years and years. What message is Congress sending to the nation, to TIPOs and all the organizations that you work with, if we don't, and if it continues to linger like this?
Ranking Member Grijalva, it's very concerning. It sends a troubling signal ahead of an important anniversary of the nation, that our history and our culture is not receiving the priority that it needs and deserves. We think that that the time should be dedicated to figuring out what this authorization should be in the long term.
The permanency of it?
The permanency, which the National Trust supports, and the full funding for that. It's an idea whose time has come. And we also recognize the challenges in the current Congress and the need to not have it linger and stand out there. And so we're grateful for efforts by the administration and in the Senate to include a 1-year authorization as a fallback measure. We think that would be preferable to having no authorization out there and the signal that sends.
And that seems to be the path that everyone has been talking about, the stopgap, which really doesn't deal with the long term, and I think going forward, it's about the permanency of that commitment. I think it's also about talking with the committee and with colleagues about, even within the committee's jurisdiction, raising through staffing and attention that profile on the legislative side, and in terms of cultural and historic preservation. But I also see it as coming up to that anniversary, is that one of the things that I think what you do offers, and I'm talking collectively of all of you, offers is this very complex history of America, warts and all, blemishes and all, is an integrated history. And if there's a unifying point and a common meeting ground for the American people, regardless, it is this arena offers us a great opportunity to celebrate who we are, but also, more importantly, to discover who we are in many cases. I love to go to other parts of the country and see the Victorian houses. My God, what are those? You know, we don't have too many of them back in Tucson, but you come to Tucson and petroglyphs, adobe buildings that are built at the turn of the 1700s, and the list goes on. And so that's part of the identity. I think that's the contributions. And in terms of indigenous and tribal importance, that has been marginalized for so long that as this prominence is raised, the reaction is it's another means to slow us down. And I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's why the commitment and the authorization is so important, because it's self-fulfilling prophecy. The more work that is required and demanded of these offices in terms of consultation and check-through, the less staffing, the less technology, the less outreach, the less ability to be competitive in terms of surveys and other things, and staffing, the longer it takes. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think we'd be smart of us to get ahead of it. And I think that's what you've presented to us today. Those of us that are here from the committee, my two colleagues today, we're going to talk about this and how we can continue to, beyond the good work that the caucus does here in the House of Representatives, what legislative initiatives are out there and how we can, our advocacy for this can be more effective and programmatic going forward. I want to thank you. We're going to rely on you, and thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman, I do think we should take a moment to acknowledge future leadership, since the chairman called out his daughter at the beginning, and this is all about historic preservation. What we're talking about here is the future, and so I think we should extend also to Kayla, your daughter, that I'm glad she was brought into this room because she's the future of this movement and this effort. So shout out to her.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
A generation of young people and grandkids that I have that can grow up comfortably knowing, not having to say, I didn't know, that would be nice. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was good. Nice job. Did you like it? Yep.